Hello and welcome to Architecture of Change. I'm your host, Leanne Mair, and thank you in advance for taking the time to come and listen to me. Today's episode is the final episode in the first season, which is the Power and Progress season. And I'll be talking about the evolution of modern leadership. And this topic is I believe, so multifaceted. Because the definition of modern, I'm not even sure if modern was the right word, right? Maybe it's like contemporary leadership, like the leadership of today rather than modern leadership. And the reason why I'm making that distinction as I'm thinking about this is because the balance that needs to be tethered to be a leader today is very different to what was needed to being a leader today, but also a forward-looking leader 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that there's different, I could even say a modern leader is a forward-thinking leader, but even that doesn't quite encapsulate what I'm really thinking about in this kind of context of modern/contemporary leader. Because ultimately, once upon a time, I love that, once upon a time, being a leader meant, following hierarchical structures. You got to the top, you were the only person to make decisions. How you got to the top was, in many cases, not a collaborative effort, and in many cases that still hasn't changed today. But it was a very traditional, I'm not going to say one-trick pony in that sense, but there was one style in which to be a leader, and that was it. And I think now the difficulty is that in many cases, this hierarchical style, this very traditional style of leadership hasn't gone anywhere. And the challenge is that it won't be going anywhere anytime soon, despite conversations around what leadership is today. And the reason I think that is, if we still look, and I'm going to come back to my favorite power pyramid, but if we look at the power pyramid and look at who's sitting at the top of this pyramid structure, it's still white men. And it's still white men that occupy most of the leadership positions. Now, this isn't said in any derogatory way. This is just said as a statement of fact. And in many cases, the type of leadership that is in place and the type of leadership that is considered for succession planning is still the same. So let's just say the demographic of the average CEO or the average senior member of staff right now is, I don't know, a 55-year-old man, as an example. Please do not feel targeted, 55-year-old men, white men, please do not. But, just say that that's a demographic who has had a certain type of role model in order to enable his progression. Now, when he's doing his succession planning, most of the time, we all have affinity bias. We like people who are like us. And a lot of us operate under the phrase of, if it's not broken, why fix it, or something like that. If it's not broken, why change it, why fix it, etc. But you know what I'm trying to get at. So if you kind of combine those two things and say that a generation is 7 years, the men who are meant to take their place, and even the women who are meant to take their places in these roles, will be defined by the traditional metrics of leadership based on, this is what I've done so far, this is what has enabled my success, and this is what the organization needs in order to succeed. I need you to be this way. And I think this part of it makes it very, very difficult if you are a modern leader who is forward thinking and wants to really embed equality and equity into your organization, who really wants to change the way the paths to leadership have existed up until now, and also who wants to live a life that is not necessarily 100% defined by work. And that's a really, really tricky position to be in, because the handover, the shift in a lot of organizations is that they're not ready for a modern leader. And it's they're not ready for a leader who is looking at things from a different perspective, who does things differently. In most cases, succession planning is done with people who are, yes, familiar with the business, but also very similar to the leadership that's already in place, because the requirement is to keep the organization stable. Which might not be in the best interests of the majority of employees or the majority of the organization. But in order to maintain that external stability, it's better if the person who comes into the organization is pretty much more of the same. More of the same, one of the same. So the question becomes like, how do you, as a modern leader, how do you get to, or, I'm going to say an aspiring modern leader, how is it that you get to that next point? And in many cases, when I look at this, the different generations, I think that from an age perspective, and I'm not saying this just because I belong to this group, by the way, but I think that there is something around geriatric millennials who are still involved, still kind of recognize, I'm going to say, traditional leadership. It's not a criticism, because there's things to learn from both tradition and modern leadership, but also are potentially more technologically savvy, more involved on the ground, more willing. Not always, because we still see this in intergenerational challenges, to be open to some of the changes. It's not always the case, but I think that's a good start. Because I think that in order to live out your full modern leadership dreams, there's this element of also needing to be able to understand fully. And when I say fully, I mean not just the negatives, but also the positives of more traditional leadership styles. And in order to do that, I'm not saying you have to necessarily embody said behaviors that you don't feel to be positive. But I think, like with any sort of, whether it's intergenerational or different positioning, there has to be a mutual recognition and mutual respect of the value that each counterpart brings. And sometimes I feel like this is a conversation that gets lost, is that there's this expectation that something new has to be a complete destruction, which I don't think it has to be, because deconstruction doesn't mean, in my opinion, deconstruction doesn't mean that you're destroying something. It's understanding, how does it work and how can we make it better? Where do we need reinforcements? Where do we need to make changes? What is it that works well but might need a tweak? And I think that's the part of modern leadership that sometimes gets a bad rap, because a lot of the time it's not recognizing that there are, not completely, but there are some values to traditional leadership. The question is, what are they? And I'm not going to kind of get into that conversation today. This is more looking at dynamics, systems, points of friction, because if you think about it, once again, concentrations of power, and not just concentrations of power, but how networks work. You'll find that in one particular group, there will be 10 people who are 10 CEOs of organizations, or 10 people who are heads of in similar types of organizations. And the conversations reflect the challenges that they face, but the conversations also reflect their belief system and values and how they see the organization going forward. And if somebody presents themselves as being too much of an outlier, even if it's the right thing for the organization, it will not be accepted or received in the way in which it's meant or given. Because coming back to this piece about affinity bias, And this is not to say that modern leaders need to contort themselves into being, traditionalist. It's more saying that you have to find a point of commonality in order to provide stability, but in order to provide a basis upon which to build a relationship in order to fully inhabit the role that you want as a modern leader. To be able to build that trust and be able to speak to all of your stakeholders, to be able to speak to all of your shareholders in a way that shows that you understand not only where the organization is, but also where your industry is, that you have a vision of where you see things going in the future. Not just that, but that you want to learn and understand what their vision is, and potentially where are the commonalities, where are the convergences, where are the divergences, and how do we get there? Because the parts of progress when it comes to leadership and the changing over of hands in leadership does not happen always, or doesn't always happen in formal settings. Part of it is about being able to understand that this person that you are working with understands your problems from your perspective. We don't have to have the same perspective, but you need to be able to understand my point of view if I'm going to trust you, and if you're going to be playing devil's advocate going forward. And I think that's a real challenge that we face, is that, yes, obviously, of course, I'm generalizing, but this is how we get to spaces of an impasse, that we don't always, or the baton is not handed over to the person that could potentially bring the organization into a new era, because they feel too different. And I'm not saying that it's right. I'm saying that commonality is required sometimes in order, and I'm not talking about from a gender perspective or a race perspective or anything else. I'm just saying that commonality is sometimes required in order to be able to get into the room, to start to build trust and to have those conversations on your own merit. And it has to be authentic commonality, not contrived commonality in order to create that access. Because without wanting to genuinely actively learn, we don't really stand a chance of making the changes that we want to make. And we also don't stand a chance of getting the support that we would like in said organization. And I think part of this is, I don't know where I said it, but I know I made a video somewhere talking about, as leaders, we can't just talk about policies. We can't just talk about gender equality, gender equity. We can't just talk about, these topics as topics. It has to be something that we live. It has to be something that we embody. And sometimes, we don't want to share everything, but sometimes we have to share more than we would like to in order to show why and how it works. Being demonstrative rather than always having to have long-winded discussions about topics that you feel like you've banged your head on a wall against for like a really, really long time. And I think that the evolution of modern leadership once upon a time was just within the scope of, being able to, identify trends, but it was not always the requirement to be able to look at technology and think about the impacts, to think about, think about injustice. It was never a requirement, because the requirement of most organizations was to do one very or two very specific things. And as long as they continue to do those things very well, and you as at the helm of that organization, or someone that aspired to be at the helm of the organization, continue to ensure that productivity was the main output, the rest wasn't really required. There was someone to be the technology department. There was somebody to do and think about all these other things. Whereas now I think that, and also there's this other element, which is what I was talking about in terms of living what you're doing. Living leadership once upon a time was making sure, you put in, they're called man hours, but man hours, or putting in the hours continuously at the office to demonstrate that that's what a leader did. And I think part of modern leadership is taking a more holistic view that there is not the work individual and the home individual, but that they are those are two of the same person. It's not two separate people. You are the same person in both. And that in my philosophy of lifestyle architecture, that it's a work-life integration over being a work-life balance. Now, balance is different for everybody. And this is why I talk about integration rather than balance, just because I'm not sure that balance is always possible. But integration is. And even that as a concept feels strange for a lot more traditional people, traditional leaders. And we're seeing that in the and I saw this as part of kind of research for my book, in terms of how people view office presence, how more traditional leaders view office presence. And I'm not saying that being in the office isn't important. I don't think it's necessarily required 5 days a week, but that's like another topic anyway. But I think that part of being a modern leader is also intentionally architecting how you can be your most effective, how you can be a role model, not just within the space of work, but really living, work-life integration. But above and beyond that, being very intentional in valuing the contributions and valuing the leadership style. You don't have to be in agreement with it, but valuing the leadership style that came before you, that had and has its successes, but really thinking about how can I optimize that. Because I think that's another shame in the way sometimes we interact with each other intergenerationally, is that we are not always prepared to recognize this value that each generation has. And we're not necessarily prepared to recognize how we contribute to that. And I've taken a note here, and I'm gonna say some of the modern requirements, or some of the things that I think are requirements for leadership competencies. One is emotional intelligence. It sounds obvious, but being able to read the room is not to be being able to read the room is not to be underestimated as a skill. And also there's this I had a t-shirt that said this, which says anecdotes are data. And more that I have conversations with senior executives and also kind of aspiring leaders, is that we need to lean more in, and I lean into, but anyway, we need to lean into the power of anecdotes. And part of believing that anecdotes are still data is all wrapped up in the emotional intelligence side of things. It's being able to understand tone. It's being able to understand looks. It's being able to really read what is going on. And sometimes the answer is not within a policy. It's not within governance. It's not within any of those things. It's within you as the individual to provide and create whatever it is that that person that you're speaking to needs. The second one is digital fluency. And it's really interesting. And this feels like this is going to feel like a little random comment that's kind of going off on an axis. But I saw this TikTok video, and the guy in the video was talking about modern parenting. And he was saying that, with the increase in using tablets and, for example, kids watching YouTube, that modern parenting is also about going into YouTube and looking at where there are how you can filter out adverts because they've gone advert crazy, and what kind of things you can filter out. And it's this part that I liken to modern leadership, which is digital fluency. It's not that you have to be an expert at everything, but having an awareness of both the hidden dangers and also the advantages of leveraging technology, of engaging with technology, instead of outsourcing the fact that you have a team to do it, or outsourcing the need to know. And I think a lot of successful leaders today, modern leaders today, have and it's wrapped up in all of this as well. They have a fundamental intellectual and life curiosity. Curiosity, I think, is one of the most important fundamental characteristics of any leader, but especially today. And when I say the intellectual and life curiosity, is because when you look at things from a work-life integration perspective, you can leverage both the technological side, the emotional side, in both work and play and everything in between, because maintaining that curiosity has an impact on both. And how you are in life, whether sometimes we don't like to admit it, how you are in life is how you are as a leader. We can say, people who are, very draconian at work say I'm very different at home. Maybe, but more than likely not. You just don't recognize it in yourself because you think that in the different surroundings you're completely different, when if it's a core part of your personality, it won't be any different. The third one, so we've had so it's been emotional intelligence, digital fluency, all underscored by a general intellectual and life curiosity. The third one is cultural competence. Cultural competence. And cultural competence can mean so many different things. It might mean you're an international person who is seconded to different locations for work. Have you tried to integrate, or are you hovering above and not really trying to understand the cultural differences in the setting that you're living in? Are you going into different locations and being like, I come from headquarters and this is what we do, ergo you need to do the same? Or are you going in to observe? Have you understood the organizations are still like mini villages? Have you understood the differences in cultures, potentially in front office, marketing, whatever it might be, versus other parts of the business? It's a navigation. It's a navigation through, and it's a willingness, once again understood by curiosity, that you want to understand different cultures, that you want to understand different parts of the business before making decisions as to how they operate. Or is everything just a number, a department, maybe a person that's attached to that department? And the fourth one is adaptive thinking. One of the hardest things to do, and this is why it's so important to have honest people around you that you have encouraged to not just speak up for you to say someone said something different and then you ignore it anyway. But I think one of the hardest things to do when you reach leadership is to challenge what we believe is correct and to do something different, to adapt. It's the yes, but as opposed to being able to say, maybe this doesn't work. Because once again, curiosity will continue to propel you to ask questions, challenge yourself and not just be satisfied with the first answer. Because the first answer, it might very well be right, but you still, challenging yourself to want to benchmark that, challenging yourself to want to really push forward and ask more questions is, I think, a really large part of change. And this underlying curiosity when it comes to the evolution of modern leadership, I think, although you might not necessarily advertise it as your curiosity, I think it also changes dynamics. I am not scared to ask a stupid question. And I will tell you firsthand, like, I'm going to ask a question. It's probably a stupid one. 99% of the time, people are open for you to ask a question. 99% of the time, they are. Now, you might not like the answer, or they might confirm it was a stupid question, but not for the reasons you think. And that's me joking, really. But it's this part around displaying curiosity will also allow you to change the minds of people as you're answering those questions. I always think to myself, like, and I've seen this, I'm thinking about it, when you go to a conference or you're listening you're listening to a panel and they open they open it up for Q&A, and someone in the audience just asks a question that just shows how ridiculously intelligent they are, and then inside you're a little bit jealous. That's me anyway. But asking good questions is also a sign of intelligence. And sometimes we don't ask those questions. And I think this part around maintaining curiosity is a really important part in driving and role modeling, how organizations can and should operate at their optimum. Because if you're displaying kind of cultural competence, adaptive thinking, digital fluency, all of these types of characteristics, it then engenders and encourages others within the organization to want to do and display the same. It also defines how people could progress within the organization, because what do they say? You can't be what you can't see. Once people see that there's a different way of being able to succeed, it encourages them to engage with those parts of themselves that they probably didn't feel like they could do under more traditional kind of structures. And I don't know, like, I would love to hear, as with every one of these podcasts, it's the collective design of solutions, right? It's not just me, but these are the things that I think about in terms of power and progress, is that, like, if we want to progress organizationally and if leadership sets the tone, we can't expect that more traditional leadership is going to automatically hand over to a more modern type of leader, when there's still a gap to be bridged between the two, if there is no intentionality around making that change. And then comes the negotiation of, like, what does a modern leader do with power, which I think could be a part B. Should it be a part B? If you've got this far, then please let me know. Should the next conversation, should there be one more episode around modern leadership directly and power? Because so far I've talked about it in the construct of being a modern leader and receiving power from more traditional leadership styles. But should there be a part B to this conversation? And should that part B be how does a modern leader interact with power, and how is it different from traditional structures? Let me know what you think. But as usual, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Architecture of Change. This has been the Power and Progress series, and I hope you've enjoyed it just as much as I've enjoyed it. So, wishing you another happy Friday, and I look forward to seeing comments. Please use hashtag Architecture of Change, messages, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much.